David Lowen, head of the climate department at EPE, and I am very pleased to welcome you at this session, how to engage the value chain in the net zero challenge. To make sure to bring a European perspective in this session, we organize together this session with Forética, a leading sustainability network in Spain, EPE, a French business network of a large French company, and IHG International Hotel Group. In the past years, net zero has become the new normal. It's a good news. For companies, it brings also a new challenge because it requires drastic emission and dramatic action within their value chain. Because one of the key challenges of net zero is actually that it requires from company to act beyond what they directly control, and they need to address area where they don't have full control. For example, we can think about the services and the product which are provided by the suppliers. We can also think about the use phase of product. Even if you produce a very nice car, it will in the end depend of how it is used, of the consumption pattern, and even of the behavior of your customers. All these topics where it is very difficult to act. And it's really a challenge because for this company, this indirect emission may represent until 70 to 80% of their entire GHG emission. So it's a big challenge. It raises many questions. How to engage all the stakeholders which are involved in this indirect emission? What tools, what process, what incentive can company provide in order to engage the stakeholders? And in the end, what solution can we implement at individual level, but also at collective level? So that's the goal of this session, to address this challenge, to identify them, to share solutions, to discuss them. And I am very pleased now to give the floor to German Ganda, the General Manager of Forética, who is going to guide us in this discussion. German.
So good afternoon to all. Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you very much for the efforts of your team organizing this event here today. We are here in the European Union Pavilion at COP26 in Glasgow, full house. Thank you to the audience here very much. Warm welcome to our speakers today, to our panelists, the ones here in the room, the ones that are following virtually, and also to all the audience that are going to follow all this session. We have prepared a slide, though. I think you will going to see it in the screen, so you can, whenever you want, post any question to the panelists, and at the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A right with our panelists. So let's move on because we only have 60 minutes. We are running out of time, right, in almost everything, but today we have this afternoon 60 minutes to talk about this net zero challenge and how to involve the supply chain. And I would like to start introducing the panelists, starting with Antonia Gowell. She's member of the Executive Committee of the World Economic Forum, also head Climate Action, Deputy Head Platform for Global Public Goods, and you are doing a fantastic work, moving coalitions, moving a lot of initiatives in terms of accelerating this journey towards net zero. If at the starting point, if you can share us little insights of what you are doing in the World Economic Forum.
No, happy to. I think first of all, an absolute pleasure to be here discussing these important topics. Maybe I can just paint a bit of a picture of some of the work that we're trying to do to drive collective action with companies, but also in collaboration with governments. And I think that's an important point as well. So just as one example, we host something called the CO Climate Leaders Alliance. This is a group of over 100, up to about 113 companies now, who represent about 7.2 trillion in market capitalization. They operate across over 45 countries and 12 industries. So quite a significant set of global players as we're talking about value chain impact who operate really value chains throughout the world. And so one of the things that we need to do, I think collectively, is continue to raise ambition of the business community. And so this is a group that has set net zero decarbonization goals by 2050 and who are really trying to advocate not only for more action from governments in collaboration, but really first and foremost laying out all of the actions that they themselves are taking as that first step, including in their Scope 3 emissions. So I think one of the roles that we have to play is really pushing ambition. We don't anymore sit in a space where we have time for business to say, well, we'll act if government acts and vice versa. We all have to act together and really drive momentum forward. So that's sort of one piece, is really we have to send that ambitious story, and the business community has to step forward and play that role. It's not about waiting for anybody else to kind of push them in that direction. The second then is, okay, fine, you have a 2050 net zero objective. What does that mean, right? So you have to then translate that and backtrack it backwards. And businesses are good at doing this. They know how to plan short term. We need to now plan for delivery on short-term climate action, right? And this is probably where we have a lot of work to do. We need to go from 2050 to half by 2030. And then what are we doing today to get on track to delivering that? And I would just argue there's a couple things. One is, of course, we have to scale rapidly all of the available solutions that we have. We've seen the incredible decrease, for example, in the price point on renewable energy technologies. We don't really have an excuse anymore to not really be investing in those solutions. The second thing, and this ties to a partnership that we launched this week with the US government and over 35 founding partners, is about how do we start investing today to scale innovations that we know we need by 2030, because they will be critical as part of that decarbonization pathway beyond then, the First Movers Coalition. And this very much links to supply chain. This very much links to how are we going to decarbonize the heavy industry down our supply chain in shipping, in aviation, and mobility. This is a combination of, sometimes asset that these businesses own themselves, fleets, but most of the time it actually sits further down their supply chain because they're shipping products around the world. And in certain cases, these types of emissions are not prioritized by some of these businesses because they say, well, that's only 2 to 3% of my emissions. But as an industry, these industrial sectors represent a third of global emissions. So it depends on how you slice the emissions pie. But if you ignore that third of global emissions because it sits in a distributed value chain across these industries, then we have a big problem by 2030. So I think, as I say, it's about really driving these long-term targets, that's clear, but then how do we translate that into these near-term plans for businesses, but then these real initiatives where we're committing, and this is using purchasing power, committing today, and therefore companies putting money on the table to invest in these solutions that we know we need tomorrow. So I think, just to kind of, let's say, start the conversation, I think this is the spectrum of things that we need to see from the business community, and we are starting to see from the business community. But I'm just going to add another layer, because we're in the European Commission pavilion here. You absolutely need governments to be able to accelerate that change. It doesn't all come from the business community. We have a green premium still. We need to draw that down. A fast way to draw that down, of course, is carbon pricing, but also incentives to help invest in R&D for these solutions, which again can be done jointly and in collaboration. So it's not about waiting for one or the other, but if we want to move fast, then we have to move together. So I'll stop there just to
Thank you,
open the discussion.
Very interesting insights. We also have, and we welcome Andreas Arends, Head of Climate of IKEA, right? And with also very interesting objectives linked to net zero, and also trying to engage all the value chain, especially suppliers. That's right, Andreas.
Yes, exactly. So our commitment is to become climate positive by 2030 by reducing more greenhouse gas emissions than the IKEA value chain emits while growing the IKEA business. And we'll do this without carbon offsets. And I think coming back to your question on how to drive it in the supply chain, I think one of the issues sometimes we think about the scope 1, 2, and then we toss everything in scope 3 into like one big bucket. I think we need to decipher that. Those are accounting rules. It has nothing to do with how you actually take action. I mean, us as a retailer, we can choose which materials we have in our products. We can steer material innovation to improve new products. We have a very close relation with our manufacturing suppliers, a partnership. We actually call them supply partners. We have ocean shipping a critical part. Use at home, a quarter of our climate footprint, or decreasing now due to fantastic movements in energy efficiency. But that's also things we can move, or also the EU can move, based on the eco design directive as well. So I think it's key to decipher the value chain footprint in order to take action. And if you do that, you can then set specific goals, not just one scope 3 goal, but for the entire business of your company. And like, how much can you address in manufacturing? How much can you do in ocean shipping? How much can you use at home, etc.? And then turn it into concrete roadmaps that you have internally. So that I don't, if you would work in IKEA, I would tell you should reduce by 40%. And you were going, I have no idea how to do that. Instead, I tell you, well, you need to procure renewable electricity, phase out that coal, and maybe you're done by 2030. And then we can take the other parts of that other natural gas boiler that you also have on site. So it becomes concrete.
Absolutely. We also welcome Hélène Valade, Environment Development Group Director of LVMH, probably sharing, of course, that commitment with net zero, and also some challenges and opportunities. Let's talk also about opportunities, if there are, in the supply chain, right?
Yes, but first of all, I'm not at ease with this concept of net zero, because for me, net zero is a goal that concerns the planet and should therefore be addressed to states. At company level, it's fairer, more coherent and more honest to speak of a contribution to neutrality, to carbon neutrality. Because if everyone continues to emit CO2 as long as they offset emitted carbon, we won't get there. The priority for me is to have a real carbon emissions reduction strategy. I prefer the term carbon budget, calculated according to planetary limits. It's very important to be very clear about net zero. Your question, how to engage the suppliers at LVMH, we have hundreds of thousands of suppliers in main activities, in wines and spirits, perfumes and cosmetics, fashion and leather goods, watch and jewelry, and selective retailing businesses. Scope 3 represent 94% of our global carbon footprint. That is why we have set up a very ambitious goal to reduce Scope 3 to minus 55% by 2030. It's very challenging because we don't have full control over Scope 3. And we focus our efforts on the largest contributor to Scope 3, purchasing, the purchase of materials such as wool, grapes, glass. And this work on Scope 3 gives purchasing department a new role, a key role, because we exclude products that come from regions at high risk of deforestation and water stress. We require our suppliers to respect standards that include carbon and biodiversity criteria, and we monitor compliance with these criteria through supplier audits. For example, gold certified cotton is 80% less CO2 than the normal cotton. Another way we work with our suppliers is to help them practice regenerative agriculture, for example, for cotton cultivation or for livestock. That is agriculture without pesticides or that favors field rotation. In short, I think suppliers become partners.
I think Andreas may make a sign to react. As you react, I always wanted you to include, we talk about suppliers in the value chain, but at the end, they're also consumers. So you can say what you want and react to what Elena said, and maybe both of you also, we can include before we ask the remote panelists to bring them to the floor, so you can react.
Just a reflection on your question about net zero and the role of offsets. And I think that's why I'm so happy now that we finally have a standard for companies of what net zero standard is through the science-based targets, where there's no offsets, where it's clear, bio is drastic emission reductions by 50% by 2030, and by 2050 it's at least 90%. and then you neutralize the remaining part. And of course, you should do things in addition to that. I mean, we see enormous need for financing in restoration projects, renovation projects, so on. But that is not a discount for your responsibility or input.
Yes, but I don't think it's very clear for everybody.
No, but it was just launched 1.5 weeks ago. So I think we all have now a responsibility, I would say, as leaders in companies taking climate action, to share that and build a momentum for this, because it's been so long discussed. And I think you can also maybe build on that. The zero discussions in companies have been so long, and now we have a definition, and it's key to just agree on it, and so we can stop discussing and more taking action.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I'm going to agree. I mean, I think the fact that the Science Based Targets Initiative has now created that common framework is incredibly important. But simple. And I think that that's key. And I just wanted to also draw in one other dimension to this conversation when we're talking about the supply chain, and you touched on this. It's partnership with the suppliers. I think, remember that we are at COP26, and a big part of the discussions here is how do we ensure that the entire world transitions to a carbon carbon reduction future, so that we can stay within 1.5 degrees. I think one thing, and that has to be done in a way that is just and enables economies to grow. And I think the companies have such an incredible role to play in making sure that that is the direction that we travel. Because it is almost too easy to say, as a company, I will become net zero tomorrow, and then I'm going to just drop a whole supply base because they are not today carbon neutral. How do you act as a partner in that transition as quickly as possible to facilitate those supply chain actors in markets that are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change invest in their transition? Because when the governments are talking about 100 billion, I think let's be clear that we need trillions in order to fully transition those economies, and that money has to come from the private sector. So I think this for me is a critical part of the industry's role in terms of supporting a global transition as well, in a way that lifts up all of the players around the world, rather than sort of being kind of purist and green tomorrow because I've set an SBTi target. That's good, but I think as part of that we need to really form this partnership with the supply chain. And so I think seeing that partnership relationship is really critical, because I do worry that the response will simply be, well, look, I'm green, but actually I've left all my supply chain behind, and that's something that I think we need to certainly avoid.
Well, we'll have time probably in the Q&A to go deeper in that aspect, but let's move on to the consumer side. So Andreas and Helene, consumers have certain expectations, realistic, no? Are there opportunities there?
Yeah, it's very important to get consumers on board. The first way is to make products that last. We are not in the business of programmed obsolescence in luxury. Our products are passed on from generation to generation. And then there is a problem of packaging. At Sephora, for example, we encourage customers to bring in their perfume bottles or cream tubs for recycling, and we offer refill systems. But I think there is another issue, perhaps the most important, that of changing our lifestyles. And for that, advertising has a very important role to play. In France, policymakers encourage companies and company agencies to do responsible advertising. What does it mean? That there are ads that promote lifestyles that are not compatible with ecological transition. For example, ads for cars with only one driver. At LVMH, we are thinking about promoting more environmentally friendly lifestyles in advertising. We need to invent a new way of life that is compatible with the protection of nature. And we are working on this topic with EPE, with EPE, Entreprises pour l'Environnement. And yesterday we published a guide on stereotypes in advertising. It's very promising.
Andreas?
I would say when it comes to consumer engagement, it's almost a session by itself, I would say. But of course, in many ways. You can see both with the demands from customers, but also how you enable customers as well. I mean, the supplier customer base, we have people who are very, very interested. Some people are rather interested, and then also people who don't. They just want to buy a bookshelf because they need a storage solution at home. And we need to find ways that all of them can live a more sustainable life. And I think it's both based on the function of the products you offer, as well as what we call, it's built in. So what materials have been used and how been produced, so that it's almost like the default option. But then it's also, I would say, an important part of affordability as well. I think it's today fairly easy to make a sustainable product, which is very, very expensive. But then most people can't afford it. So I think that's also where we companies, we need to work to scale solutions and not just find that small niched material, but to really make it on economy of scale. So it really has also a societal impact. So it's not just by the customers, but it has to take a big part of market share. So we have a huge responsibility in actually keeping affordability and finding business models to maintain that. Then from customer interest, it's also, I would say also, if people are wanting to know, but it's also what can you communicate as well. So how do you communicate in an easy fashion? Well, I think all of us can agree that supply chain issues are rather complex and maybe not the easiest to convey to customers. So I think it also needs to be a difference of what you actually can communicate to customers, and then what you still regardless need to take responsibility of and just reduce it, not and hoping that they trust you that you have taken the right decisions.
Okay, so it's time now to include our remote panelists. So I think probably Catherine Dalton, Chief Sustainability Officer of IHG Hotels and Resorts, is somewhere there virtually.
Can you hear me, Gemma?
Hi, Catherine.
Hi there, how are you?
Fine, thank you, and thank you also for co-organizing this event today here in the EU Pavilion at COP26. Hope to see you soon.
Yes, it's great to be here. Thank you everybody for joining today. It's been a great conversation so far. So maybe I could just start by telling you a little bit about IHG. So we have 6,000 hotels in over 100 countries, with 17 brands ranging all the way from Intercontinental and Six Senses through to Holiday Inn Express. And I think what's really relevant to this conversation for us is that those hotels are heavily skewed towards franchise. So we have to work hand in hand with those third-party owners really to drive change. And they do make up the majority of our Scope 3, so very, very pertinent for this conversation. As far as what we've been doing around the Net Zero Challenge, earlier this year we launched our Journey to Tomorrow, which is a set of 2030 responsible business commitments across 5 key areas of people, communities, energy, waste and water. And we've been doing a huge amount of work, as you would expect, on the energy and decarbonisation side. So we already had a 2-degree aligned science-based target, which we are in the process of upgrading, that obviously covers our scopes 1, 2 and 3. And we've joined Race to Zero. And I think what was really interesting in what Antonio was saying at the very start was the amount of work that needs to go behind those targets. So we've spent a huge amount of time road mapping how we can get to those targets, understanding what our key levers are as a company, thinking about those 6,000 hotels. So for us, there are 3 main elements of that strategy. So really thinking about how we avoid emissions in the first place. So thinking about as we grow, and we're growing very quickly, how you bring on those net zero new build hotels. And then thinking about the existing hotels, those existing 6,000 hotels, how we actually decarbonise those. And actually we published a white paper a few months ago in partnership with Arup, Schneider and Gleeds, the first of its kind actually in the industry, looking at those steps to move an existing hotel, so a typical Holiday Inn in the UK, towards net zero emissions, which was a really interesting study and that we think can be applied across the whole industry. So I think that we're doing a lot of work there. And I think what you were saying around the consumer side is particularly important as we think about how we really get traction and drive action towards some of these plans. So we know that our guests have a growing appetite for a more sustainable and responsible stay. So when we launched Journey to Tomorrow earlier this year, we commissioned a global study of almost 10,000 adults. And this revealed that actually more than 80% of those people said it was important to choose a hotel brand that operates more responsibly. And really, really importantly, those people will spend almost 1/3 more on accommodation that they know meets that expectation. So that's really, really important. It's also really important for us to empower our guests with options for a more sustainable stay. So we have a greener stay program where we reward our loyalty members who choose to take sustainable actions. And I think the other thing that's very, very important and driving a huge amount of change is our corporate clients. So as we were talking about Scope 3, we obviously make up the Scope 3 emissions from a travel perspective of many of those very big corporate clients. So they, in the last 6 months to a year, have been really ramping up their asks in terms of data. So wanting to understand what the footprint of their stays with us are. So we have incorporated a feed from our own systems into the RFP process to allow our hotels to respond to that data. And we're also working really closely with the travel bookers at those big companies to actually understand what sustainable accommodation and meeting options we can provide. So be it a waste-free stay or actually understanding how we can help incentivize their colleagues to make those more sustainable choices. So I think actually this growing momentum on the consumer side, we need to meet that with real transparency and accuracy of information right across that guest journey, and maybe working with others in hospitality as well. We're already doing that. And also just creating that really approachable and digestible content to inform and inspire those guests and customers to make those more responsible decisions. So a huge amount of storytelling and just making this really simple and digestible for our guests.
So thank you very much, Catherine. We will get back to you in a few minutes. But first, let me introduce our last panelist, the second remote panelist, Céline Souvran, Group Chief Sustainability Officer of AXA. I don't know, Céline, if you are ready to connected.
Do you hear me well?
How are you? Good afternoon.
Hello. So I was in Glasgow the whole week from Monday to Friday, and I already missed Glasgow, so I'm so happy to come back remotely with you.
Well, happy the next time. So Céline, well, you've been here about the issues in the value chains, from suppliers to consumers, also the issues around the franchise model of IHG Hotels and Resorts Group, and we also want to hear the expectations for investors. What else, apart from reflecting of those issues, if you can bring also that conversation that we're seeing every day, and investors' expectations are growing.
Yeah, so I'm the representative of the finance sector in this panel. And yes, for the finance sector, there is slight difference because our position is a little bit different regarding what is at the heart of this discussion today. So we distinguish 3 parts in our activity regarding CO2 emission, GHG emission on one net zero trajectory, because we have a footprint from our own operation with a lot of impact from digital activities, because our production tool is digital. We have a very reduced supply chain, but big impact on digital activity, because our activity are mainly digital, and we are committed to reduce and to be carbon neutral on our own operation by 25 in our new strategic plan driving progress. We have another kind of footprint and a net zero trajectory also built around our investment activities. So on this one, it's not our direct impact, it's more our indirect impact regarding that the fact we are an enabler of the activities of the real economy, if I may use this word. As an investor, we built a net zero trajectory regarding our investment portfolio as an asset owner mainly, but also as an asset manager for our customers. On the third activities, it's the core activity of insurance. And for this one, also, we are an enabler. It's not our direct footprint. We have a very reduced supply chain on this one too. But on this one, it's really nascent. And it's true for AXA, but for the whole insurance sector. Nobody in the insurance sector, no player has already pushed a net zero trajectory for the insurance, the core insurance activity, but we are now gathered in a net zero insurance alliance to build the methodology, the metrics on the trajectory. So that's in a nutshell the three activity we have to take into account when we speak about net zero trajectory for a company like AXA. And to come back on our role as an investor, of course, our portfolio reflects the trajectory of the company in which we invest. So we have two levers to reduce the CO2 footprint of our portfolio and to build the net zero trajectory, to make some exclusion on the more carbon intensive activities, and to increase the target of our green investments. But nevertheless, even if we use very intensively at AXA these two levels, because it's really one of our priority of climate change is in our strategic plan as a huge priority. The portfolio reflects the state of the art of the real economy regarding decarbonization. So that's why, and we used to raise the alarm really beyond the existing trajectory from the real economy, what we call the warming potential. And the warming potential is the temperature of our portfolio, which reflects the decarbonization of the company in which we invest. And this warming potential is in a level of 2.7 degrees. So we observe that we are not in line with the 1.5 trajectory. We are well below the benchmark, and the benchmark of the financial sector is 3.2. So that really is the proof that AXA has made already a huge effort, but it's also the proof that we have a long way behind us to really decarbonize the whole economy. So that's where we stand.
Thank you, Celine. One more question. I would like to hear the reactions of Antonia to this question about the international context, because I'm sure you're a global company, Celine. AXA is a global company, like the ones that are sharing the panel with us today, and it's very difficult, or it's difficult at least, to be consistent in different jurisdictions, in the different types of regulations in different parts of the world, the different expectations of consumers. Well, you are committed to these net zero targets. Well, can you share with us a little bit the challenges there? How are you managing?
Yeah. So for us, the target, of course, on our commitment to have investment portfolio aligned with 1.5 trajectory is global, but the implementation is deployed locally and taking into account the local constraints. Of course, to give you a very concrete example, when we use the lever of exclusion of the most carbon intensive activities, the coal, because AXA is a pioneer on coal exclusion, we don't put the same timeline for OECD countries, because we are committed to a total exit from coal for OECD's countries by 2030. And we put a different timeline for the other part of the world, mainly emerging countries. We put the timeline for 2040. So that's an example on how, yes, we are in an interdependency with the real economy, but also the transition pathway of the countries where we operate. So that's why it's so important, yes, for us that it's the opportunity there to insist on that. The regulation is also key, the local regulation, because of course, if the country where we invest, we are in a huge transition pathway, for us, we securize through that our own trajectory. The other component which is key is the reliability of the data, because we have to check when we invest and to be aligned with and to securize again our own commitment. We need reliable data on the trajectory of the company in which we invest, on also the data of the decarbonization pathway in the country where this company operates. So that's why at each time that the regulation can help us on this one to provide and to make some regulation for the transparency of robust and reliable and comparable data, for us, it's really something which makes the difference.
So thank you, Céline. And Antonia, you have a privileged view from the World Economic Forum of the economy, of the worldwide economy. So what do you think about this topic, about the consistency of companies when they are in different regions? How can they work hardly on that?
I mean, I think it was framed quite well. I mean, in a sense, yes, we kind of look at global decarbonization at a global level. Everything is interconnected, but of course, once you start breaking that down into how different national economies and regions achieve that pathway, it will require different types of investments and kind of transition mechanisms. And I think that's kind of ultimately what we're discussing here. And it comes back, I think, also to the point that I made at the beginning around how can you be that transition partner, right, with your value chain and your supply chain. I mean, if you look, for example, at some of the work that the International Energy Agency has done to look at how the need to kind of decarbonize the energy sector, which requires kind of a halt in investment today in new fossil infrastructure, but also a huge amount of resourcing going into transitioning basically out of fossil fuel infrastructure into kind of renewables and other forms of clean energy. That sort of transition pathway does look different in different markets. It depends on the energy mix. It depends on, let's say, kind of the resource economics behind all of these different transitions in different markets as well. So I think as kind of global companies do look at their value, their supply chains, look at where their suppliers are based, the partnership that they play, be it a financing partner or a kind of buying partner, will naturally be differentiated in a sense. I think what we're lacking, and I think this is where some of the financing players, so investing in the markets, will play a critical role, is much more clarity around that transition pathway and exactly at what rate will these transitions happen in the markets, at what specific kind of volume of investment is required in order to facilitate that transition, and who are the different players and partners that need to be there to do that. And I argue that it's kind of a mix of the different types of financial market players in collaboration with those who are kind of, let's say, purchasing from those markets in order to make that transition happen quickly enough. I think today we don't necessarily have that full, clear picture of what those specific pathways look like. So there's certainly more work to do. If we can go from this sort of global energy decarbonization pathway to kind of national pathways to then, okay, how do we partner from a financing perspective, from a buying perspective, and then from a government policy and regulation perspective to make that happen collectively, that's how we get on a path to 2030. Unless we have that clear vision, clear goal, let's say, as I think was discussed, how do you go from a net zero 2050 target to kind of pragmatic implementation today? That's really where I think we need to kind of go and focus more and more in order to move quickly.
Okay, well, before the Q&A, we are now in the last round of questions. So you want to make any additional remark, and also, well, reflect a little bit about all these coalitions that are trying to move the agenda, how you balance them with your individual efforts. So we start with you, Andreas, and we do the final round, and finishing with Antonia.
Yeah, I can only echo what you're saying with partnerships and roadmaps as well. And this is, how we are driving our agenda to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I said we've set goals, and when you turn it into concrete roadmaps, what is needed to make it happen? And that is very specific. If it's manufacturing, could be manufactured textiles or wood products, etc. So we need to make it more hands-on and concrete. And the prerequisites are different. If we're seeing in our manufacturing, we have a close dialogue with our suppliers, and some could be on-site investments, and where we as a company can provide discounted loans directly to the supplier if that's needed. I think we also see the need to enable purchase of renewable electricity, because all cannot be generated on site, and where we as big corporations have a huge responsibility for SMEs. And we're seeing that at IKEA now, that if we bundle or consolidate the electricity consumption of suppliers, we can go above certain thresholds to access renewable electricity market, as well as negotiate framework agreements and possibly actually lower the cost of electricity. So it's a win-win-win all of a sudden as well. And I think that's the key, that you need to find these new business models to put business in the forefront, not just in the sustainability team, because we might not know so much business, but procurement needs to drive the agenda. When other areas are more difficult, if you say shipping, we are a small player, but we're a few actors and we're a small customer. And then we need to move away from these like buyer-supplier relations and more find each other somewhere along the value chain. And I think there are coming more and more of these coalitions and partnerships where we're seeing that as well. Going back to just shipping, we have now for the cargo owners for zero-emission vehicles, COSEV, where we see buyers of transport offer and big shippers are now joining forces to commit to net zero vessels by 2040. So we are sending the signals down to the shippers that you need to find zero-emission vehicles, and they are getting signals like at their companies, companies are requesting this as well. And then I think we can also enable that transition. We see similar things also in the steel industry and so on as well, towards fossil-free steel. So new ways to do supply chain management is really required to mitigate these gigantic challenges we have ahead.
Hélène?
Yes, I agree with you. Collective action is absolutely necessary. For example, we have just formed an alliance with Unilever and L'Oréal to define the criteria for the environmental display of cosmetic products. We expect a lot from this partnership, which will provide a simple, single and understandable label for consumers. But I have a dream. I have a dream that of collectively establishing a real measurement protocol to standardize the calculation of Scope 3. Today, this calculation is not robust, and it's a real limit in the relationship with several types of stakeholders, including investors. We could all together decide today to make an alliance on this subject and ask for the help of scientists. Is a call to action from LVMH.
So we go back to our remote panelists. So your final reflections and also your reflection about these coalitions. Catherine, how do you see the opportunities there?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, there's a real balance here. So I think individual companies need to step up and take responsibility for obviously setting their own targets and developing their decarbonisation roadmaps that suit their organisations, because obviously no two businesses are the same. I think in terms of coalitions, there are a couple of points I'd like to make here. So for us, if you think about our key stakeholders, how we engage with them as a company is really important. As I mentioned before, we have to engage with our third-party owners right at the start of this journey to ensure that they're on track, that they're making the investments that are required. And we have a specific owner committee for this. Also our colleagues. So we have some 350,000 people who are working in those hotels around the world. So they have to be engaged with. They're at the front line. They're the ones delivering these experiences to the guests. And as we've talked about before, shareholders. So just ensuring that our shareholders understand that the journey we're on. And I used to lead our investor relations team, so that's something that I'm really attuned to. Then I think if we talk about coalitions, alliances outside of our own company, this is absolutely going to be key to ensure that we achieve our aims in this space. So we need to be really effective and collaborate across that broader ecosystem. So for the hotel industry, it's not just the hotel brands, of which IHG is one, it's the operators, it's going to be the online travel agents, it's going to be the investors, and other industry organizations as well. So we just need to work together to define that common language and context, really, of what sustainability means at an industry level. You know, something that we're thinking a lot about at the moment is certification. So what is a green hotel? Lots of people are coming out trying to badge green, but actually as an industry, we need to come together to define that and to make it really understandable to our guests. So there are a number of different organizations, industry bodies that we're working with to help with this. So the Sustainable Hospitality Alliance is a charity that actually launched its pathway to net positive hospitality earlier this week. So that will really help all hotel players, regardless of size, regardless of where they are on their journey, to actually make this start, to understand how to get there, to understand what tools are in place, to help them do that. So I think there's a lot we can do individually, and we need to do individually. But in order to get everybody on the right path, everybody on this pathway, then we really, really have to collaborate.
So thank you, Catherine. And now the final remarks from Céline Subram before we open the floor to the questions here in the EU Pavilion at COP26. You can just raise your hands if you want to ask any question. And also for the virtual audience, they can use Slido, as I mentioned before. So Céline, your last remarks?
No, but of course, on the coalition are key for us to achieve our commitment, our net zero commitment. But we are very selective at AXA in the coalition because sometimes too much coalition kills the coalition. So we are very selective. And to jump on what Hélène has said, our focus is to be involved in coalition dedicated to make the data and disclosure more robust, more reliable, more comparable, because if we are all under a lot of greenwashing attack, it's sometimes because there is a lot of complexity, and that's why we need convergence between all the framework, the methodology, the data. And that's why at AXA, we are committed in coalition specific to our sector. We are in the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, with the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and with our peers. We have defined common methodology, common metrics on target setting protocol. And to give you an example, to define our intermediary target to align our portfolio on a 1.5 trajectory for 2015, the intermediary target we set to reduce the carbon footprint of 20% in 2025, we set this target in the frame of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. So it enables us to have a reliable and common framework with our peers, which make us comparable, yes, and to increase the impact together. And that's why, as I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, we have created a similar alliance, the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, to build that for the core insurance activity.
So thank you very much. We are trying to order in here the debate because there are many people wanting to ask questions. So perfect. So well, let's start. We open the Q&A, if you don't mind, with the question of Daisy Hessenberger. Thank you very much for watching. And she's asking, how do businesses view the role of nature-based solutions in regards to value chains? I don't know. Well, Andreas, if you want to react to that one. We have 3 more questions. We are not going to take any more because we are not going to have time. Yeah. So
I'll try to be short. Maybe we manage more. But I would say if we divide the question into 3 parts. First, before investing in nature-based solutions, I think all companies need to eliminate deforestation within their value chains, both directly and indirectly, say through the feed of animal-based products, because if you're going to invest in nature, you should not, on the other side, actually cause loss of nature. So that's a given. Then the second one, I think many other companies have ways to actually find these improvements in nature within their supply chains as well. A lot of focus has been on offsetting, and that should always be in addition. But if you're sourcing any type of product, it will come from nature, unless it's mineral-based. So there, I mean, by improving management practices in the forest or in agriculture, you have huge potentials, also from a landscape approach, to address this. Then we see there is a need to fill the gap of investments in resilience building, restoration, regeneration projects. And I think that comes into this in addition to what was defined now by science-based targets for the net zero standard, that you go beyond your business. So that's also a big potential as well, because we need to also, from a philanthropic side, also take our responsibility to invest in that.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. If we move on, we have a first question. If you can make the question short and also the answer, so we have time for all the questions. If you can introduce yourself, your name, and go ahead with your question. Okay.
Pascal Chariot, Enerdata, but I used to work for a big corporate company many years, so it will be quite practical. When you have 90% of your added value, which is coming from suppliers, how do you balance when you have to decide about the price and CO2 emissions? For instance, are you ready to pay more to get a closer supplier just to avoid transportation? And do you put a price to the CO2, well, to transportation and to the CO2 emissions when you evaluate the supplier? First question. And the second is, for the purchasing managers and the purchasing teams, how do you split their bonus between cost reduction and emissions reduction? Let's be practical.
Okay, no, it's very difficult in short time, but go ahead.
I mean, I can very quickly respond that, at least in our experience with some, not all, there are more and more companies who are setting an internal price on carbon, and a reasonable internal price on carbon, right? So not $5, but kind of 50 and up. As a sort of one area where, indeed, to sort of drive decision making and kind of bring in, let's say, CO2 emission considerations, that is one critical tool that they have. And then the second is that equally when we look at sort of that supply base, it is also about kind of driving that through the full supply chain in terms of decision making. The other thing, when you talk about kind of budgets, increasingly, putting carbon budgets on certain decision frameworks versus necessarily only financial, also something that more companies are doing. But I think these tools need to be scaled and used in other areas as well.
Andreas.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say also building on that, I get a bit provoked when people say cost or quality or CO2, because I mean, if you're running business, you as a procurer, you need to balance the cost, the quality, delivery performance. But all of a sudden, when we talk about sustainability, it's like, oh, it's something different. This needs to be at the heart of business decisions. And I think there's also, if you want to be relevant also in the future, you need to get your act together, because there are future costs coming as well. So I think it's also a maturity of business to move CO2 or climate as a question a bit on the side and really at the heart for what it really is. And there are also huge cost reductions to be achieved as well, as we see also the price of renewable electricity just dropping like crazy.
Okay, thank you. We move on to the next question. Don't worry, Celine, Catherine, I will give you the floor.
I just
if you want to react, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. Now, just a word on the good question raised by the people the person in the room about remuneration. I think the remuneration on the integration of these criteria, ESG criteria or CO2 related or net zero related criteria into the remuneration is very key. As an investor, is something we scrutinize, because if you display a 1.5 trajectory, but this 1.5 trajectory or this net zero trajectory of the CO2 reduction trajectory is not in the remuneration, there is something wrong. So that I want to insist, at AXA, we have increased the weight of these criteria from 10 to 30% into the remuneration, in the variable remuneration of our team. So that's really a key point, and I think it was an interesting question raised, and that's something very important to prove that we really hold the talk on the topic.
Yes, I agree with Céline. I think it's a very, very important point. In some maisons of LVMH, we have introduced these criteria of CO2 emission reduction in the bonus of purchasing department, and it's very interesting to see the results of this new incentive. Yeah.
New question?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Romain Poivet. I work for the French State Agency of Ecological Transition. I'm also the coordinator of the ACT initiative, and I'm a standard developer for ISO and for the Sensenelec in Europe. And because we are under the European Pavilion, I guess it's interesting to speak about standard development. First, I would like to thank you, Hélène Valade, because I really love your statement about what should be carbon neutrality for a company, because it's completely aligned with the French State Agency position. Then one comment, I think that carbon neutrality standards should not be only developed by private standard developer, but also by international standard developer like Sensenelec in Europe or ISO at international level. And my comment and question is the following one. You spoke a lot about the downstream value chain with the consumer approach perspective, I would say. And in 2013, the European Commission initiated the single market for green product. We developing the product environmental footprint methodologies and organizational environmental footprint methodologies as well. There is already this context and this frame in Europe, and I know that some of you are already involved in those product category rules development, for instance, but to date there is no environmental labeling for final consumer. There is nothing mandatory, only voluntary program. So what will happen in the close future? It's the first question, and how you as World Economic Forum or companies will support the development and the implementation of such public policy. And I really welcome your position and statement about developing a standard for your sector. So yeah, what are we waiting for environmental labeling for consumer?
We have 3 minutes left, so very, very short, and also Catherine probably wants to react to something. So I don't know if Catherine wants to say something, final remark. If not, we go to Andreas, who wants to answer.
Yeah, I think it was. Can you hear me? It's Catherine. It's not very clear. The question from the room exactly what it was, but I think it was around green standards. Is that correct? So I think absolutely. I think having that consistency by sector is going to be really, really important, because there is so much. There is a lack of clarity at the moment, and as I said before, I think it's really, really hard for consumers to understand what they're buying, what to look for. So I think the sooner we can understand and come to some agreement around what those sort of green classifications are the better.
Okay, thank you. So 1 minute, final remark.
Just a remark on say how to develop carbon neutrality claims. There, I think it's on many levels, and not maybe just companies as well. So we, IKEA, we engaged to update the ISO standard for climate neutral or carbon neutral as well, and where we opposed that carbon offset would be used because we think it's misleading. But then it was also non-company actors who actually managed to keep it as part of a definition. So I think it's on many levels where we need to take it as well. And I think also with a net zero standard now within a company, I mean, that has been developed with WWF, World Resource Institute, and then companies buying in. And I think it's heavily based on the IPCC 1.5 report. So I think there is a point where, I mean, the science is there. And of course, some companies maybe still is misleading, but I think there's also a great leadership now shift that's happening as well, which needs to be recognized.
I think my only point was just coming back to this consumer standard piece. I mean, we need standards, we need kind of common frameworks like SBTI at a kind of macro level that then needs to translate into how that basically results in products for consumers that are effectively net zero, quote unquote, green. But in order to achieve scale, those need to become default, right? It's not about a kind of specific label. It's about how does that become the embedded default across everything, every product and service that is on the market at the end of the day. Of course, conscious, and I really hate the word consumers. How many people wake up in the morning and say, I am a consumer? None of us are, one person. We're not consumers. We live our lives and we buy things that we need and we go through experiences that we enjoy. And I think there will always be a minority of people who look for a particular label. How do we make that standard the default across the markets, and I think that's what we need to strive for at the end of the day. But you need the starting point, and I think let's get from a starting point to scale really quickly and not get stuck on that starting point would be my last word.
Okay, so thank you very much. We need to end here. It has been a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much to EP, Forética, IHG, to the panelists here, the remote panelists, and the audience also virtual, and the ones that are here in the EU Pavilion here today at COP26 in Glasgow. So it's time to act, to accelerate action, and happy to hear that the organizations and companies trying to push harder in that direction. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.